Let's notice what happened when the Apostle Paul came to Thessalonica. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you, is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. So after just a few weeks of Paul preaching in Thessalonica, the gospel had been received by some of the Jews, a large number of the God-fearing Greeks, and a number of the leading women, as it said in those verses that we just read. In an effort to silence this message, the Jews intended to capture Paul and Silas, but when they couldn't find them, they took Jason and some of the brethren and brought them before the authorities in order to accuse them. Notice what the text says. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some of the brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus." The New King James Version translates this accusation this way: "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too." This shows that the gospel alone can be very effective in reaching the lost. When Paul came to Thessalonica, he did not resort to games or gimmicks or slick marketing campaigns. He simply preached. And his preaching was not filled with stories or jokes or self-help drivel. He reasoned from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence. Now, many people today might believe that this type of preaching is too dry or boring or ineffective, yet this type of preaching that clearly explained the truth and why people should believe it, that was what was so effective in causing the Jews to say that Paul and Silas had turned the world upside down. And while the preaching of the gospel did have a great impact in Thessalonica and in other places, this accusation is similar to the charge made by King Ahab against the prophet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" He said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of God and you have followed the Baals." Ahab certainly saw Elijah as a troublemaker, but the reality was that the nation's troubles were not caused by the prophet, but by the king, the one who made the initial accusation. The accusation made against Paul and Silas was true in the sense that their message was very effective and had persuaded many people, but they were not the ones who had turned the world upside down. Since the beginning, the world has been turned upside down by sin. When sin upset the world in the garden, several things were lost, including innocence, fellowship with God, and peace with God that was enjoyed previously. And the preaching of the gospel that was done by Paul and Silas and continues to be done by faithful men today seeks to restore what was lost because of sin. So, what was it that was lost because of sin? Well, first you had innocence. And in Luke's account of the Great Commission, he recorded Jesus telling his disciples that, "Thus it is written, that the Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead the 3rd day, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem." You also had, with sin, a loss of fellowship with God. And John explained his role as a witness of Christ, his and the apostles. He said, "What we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ." Sin also caused man to lose peace with God. Paul described the work of Christ in this way to the Ephesians. "For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who were near. So sin brought guilt and separation from God. The message of the gospel contains an offer of forgiveness, of fellowship, and of peace with God. So though the world may see the preaching of the gospel as turning the world upside down, the reality is we are trying to set aright what was corrupted by sin in the beginning. And if we hope to be effective in restoring the souls of men back to God, let us avoid the gimmicks and games that so many resort to today and simply do what Paul did. Faithfully preach the word. The gospel, as Paul said in his letter to the Romans. Not our wit or storytelling ability or charisma. The gospel is the power of God for salvation.